need to know about the SQE with BPP. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. This event will run from 4 until 6 p.m, and the first hour will feature a workshop led by BPP University Law School. For any interactions, make sure you have your chat set to stage so that our speakers can read your messages. In the second hour, there will be a virtual networking session over in the expo booths, so make sure you hang around to chat with all of the speakers to answer any of your questions about the SQE. Speaking of questions about the SQE, given the time, you may not get an answer to all of them, so do make sure to check out BPP's SQE FAQ page over on the Legal Cheek website, a link to which will be in the chat. So my name is Julia Sanislow, I'm a writer and researcher here, and today I'm very lucky to be joined by 4 wonderful speakers. We have BPP's Director of Outreach, Johnny Hurst, SQE1 Award Leader, Caroline Rayson, as well as SQE students, Yasmin El Sayed and Nell Thompson. Thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julia. Well, welcome everybody to everything you need to know about the SQE. I'm Johnny Hurst, the Director of Outreach at BPP, formerly a practitioner. I was a commercial property specialist, a partner in a city law firm. I'll let my colleague, my partner in crime here, Caroline, introduce herself. Caroline, you were similarly a practitioner as well, weren't you, back in the day?
I was, yes. So about half of my career is spent in the city doing corporate law in the city, and I've been at BPP for a number of years now, and I currently am involved in the delivery of the SQE programs, and I take special responsibility for the SQE1 programs at BPP, but work with all my colleagues across the board on SQE type activities.
Fabulous. And whilst we're at it with introductions, let's hear from our 2 fabulous students at the moment, Yasmin and Nell. Yasmin, do you want to just introduce yourself to us and tell us where you are in your journey to through the SQE and to hopefully ultimately get a training contract, or if you've got one already?
Yeah, so I'm Yasmin. I've already passed SQE 1 and 2, and I've just completed my master's in law as well. So I'm currently just looking for legal opportunities to complete my qualification to become a solicitor.
Fabulous. And now tell us where you are in your journey.
Hi, so I've also sat SQE 1 and 2, but I'm awaiting my SQE 2 results at the moment, so fingers crossed for me, everyone.
Fingers crossed.
I'm currently sitting the master's component of the LLM, and I have a training contract with Walker Morris in Leeds, which is due to start in September.
Fabulous. And we will hear from both of you very shortly. And just what you're probably wondering what that QR code is on the screen, in case you were interested, which if you're on this webinar, you will be. I run an independent YouTube channel called SQE TV, and the QR code will take you straight there to subscribe if you wish to, at no cost. It's lots of stuff, very similar to the sort of stuff we're going to cover in today's session, as well as looking at questions and things like that come up in the exam. So let us move on through the slides. So what are we going to cover during the course of this session? Well, we're going to tell you a little bit about BPP to begin with, the types of courses that you need to be thinking about after we've gone through an overview of the SQE, and we'll talk about the things that you need to think about when you're going through the whole of the SQE journey. And we'll hear all the time through the perspective of both Nell and Yasmin in terms of how they felt their SQE journey has been, and hopefully answer the standard FAQ type of questions. What we will do is certainly try and leave a little bit of time for a few questions at the end, but I suspect, as Julia mentioned at the top of this, we will not have time to answer many of the questions, but that's what the second hour is for in terms of the networking. So don't worry if we don't manage to answer your question in the first hour. Please do join us for the second hour, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. So just a little bit about the about BPP. We've been teaching students for over 30 years. We've been teaching generally for 40 years, but teaching law students, and in particular people qualifying as solicitors, for over 30 years. And you can see there's a number of other points there. Caroline, just do me a second if you could just, sorry, I can run through those now, beg your pardon. We exclusively train future trainees for 4 of the 5 Magic Circle firms, as you can see. and we train several thousand prospective solicitors every year, over half of which are self-funding their SQE journey at our centres across England, which you can see listed on the screen there. And no other provider has pass rates for the SQE as consistently high as BPPs have been since the start of the SQE, but more of that in a moment. So I'm now going to ask Caroline, who is the award lead for SQE 1 at BPP, just to take you through this slide here, because I know people coming on to webinars like this are coming to the SQE from different levels of experience. Some people, it might be the first time you've ever engaged anything about the SQE. So for those of you who know quite a lot about it, just bear with us. This introduction is good consolidation. It might remind you of a few things, but it's there for those who maybe are coming to the SQE relatively new. So over to you, Caroline. Do you want to take us through the SQE pathway?
Absolutely, thanks, Johnny. So we've set it out here in a circle, but actually, you don't have to undertake these things in the order as they appear here. It's just a way to present this. You need to be able to show these 4 things to be able to qualify as a solicitor now under this SQE regime. So, top right, you need to have a degree, or the equivalent of a degree. Now, for most of you, that will just be an undergraduate degree that you have undertaken. It doesn't have to be a law degree. It doesn't have to be a domestic degree, but you do have to have a degree. Okay. SQE 1 and 2, bottom right, are the assessments that the SRA, that's the Solicitors Regulation Authority, sets, which one must pass in order to qualify through this route. So in very broad terms, and I'll talk about them in a bit more detail in a second, but in very broad terms, SQE 1 is all about knowledge, and it's a broad range of knowledge, which includes both the subjects which traditionally people have studied during an undergraduate law degree, like contract and tort, but it also includes a range of what we call practice subjects. So more practical versions of law like property practice or business law and practice. So that wide range of knowledge is assessed in SQE 1. And then once you've passed SQE 1, you're eligible then to apply to SQE 2, which is more of a skills-focused assessment, and you're assessed in a number of different both oral skills and also written skills, whilst at the same time demonstrating your understanding of the law that underlies the scenario that you're advising on in your skills assessment. So SQE 2 combines the assessment of skills and also a reminder of the knowledge that you've learnt for SQE 1. The third aspect is called qualifying work experience, which lots of people shorten to QWE. A real innovation of the SQE regime and a major change relative to the previous regime that we used, which was called the legal practice course, is that this QWE can be built up over time. It can be built up with up to 4 different providers, and it can be done before, during, or after your other studies in relation to qualifying as a solicitor. So the flexibility is massively greater than we have seen in the past. So for example, a student or an applicant who has worked as a paralegal, for example, they might already have 2 years worth of really solid QWE under their belt before they even think about sitting the SQE exams. That's absolutely fine. That's one of the ways of doing it. Quite a lot of students still, like Nell will be, do their studies first and then do their QWE. But you can do any version of that, as long as you can show at the point at which you qualify, or you seek to qualify, that you've got that 2 years worth of QWE signed off. It needs to be done. Sorry, Johnny, were you going to say something?
No, carry on.
I was going to say, it doesn't have to be done in the UK, but it does need to have been signed off by an England and Wales solicitor. So generally people would be doing it in the UK. It doesn't have to be done in a law firm. It could be done in a company in-house, as long as, again, you've got a solicitor who can sign you off. And then the final requirement is you need to be a suitable character. And I'm sure there's nobody on this call for whom that would be an issue, but the SRA will ask you certain questions. And sometimes students do, or applicants do, have to explain things that have happened and establish that they are of good character. But that is the basic way in which you qualify as a solicitor under the SQE regime.
Fabulous. Thank you so much there, Caroline. So what we're now going to do is, and I can see from the poll that a lot of people wanted to know more about the SQE structure. So what we're going to do is now explain about the structure of the assessments, but also go on to look at preparation options, which was in the poll that you completed, the two most popular things that you wanted to hear about. And in particular, we're going to hear from both Yasmin and Nell as to their experience of both SQE 1 and SQE 2. So Caroline, just before we bring in Yasmin and Nell again for their own experience of SQE 1, can you just give us a summary of what the SQE 1 assessment looks like? It's quite a brutal one, isn't it? But yeah, people are passing, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So what's SQE 1 all about?
So I've already given a little bit of a flavour in terms of the breadth, but that is hopefully displayed sort of in more detail here on this slide. I mentioned before that we have a combination of what we call underlying law subjects. So those kind of law degree subjects like land law, trusts and criminal, you can see there on the right hand side under paper 2. And then practice subjects like property practice, wills and administration of estates. The brutality of these assessments comes from both the breadth of coverage of those assessments, which is set out in some technicolor there, but also the length of the assessments. So you will see bottom left that each paper is 180 questions long, and those are sat in Pearson VUE test centres, so in formal, very invigilated environments, closed book, and you split the 5 hours 6 minutes per paper in half, basically. So you sit 90 questions in just over 2.5 hours, you have a short break, and then you do the same again. Okay, so they are a very intense experience, and I would be very interested, perhaps starting with Yasmin, if you could just give a bit of a flavour of what it was like and what you think helped you most in preparing for that quite intense assessment day.
Yeah, so it was quite intense, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. You do have to kind of be mentally prepared as you go in. And I'd say the anticipation might be the hardest part. So it's the few days leading up to it, and then the couple of hours just before, and then the car ride or the train ride there. It's the anticipation and the build up that really, I think, for me at least, kind of took a toll on me. But to be honest, the moment I had sat down and the timer started, you kind of just lock in and forget that you're nervous, forget that it's intense, honestly, because you're just so focused on getting all the questions down in time. And yeah, so I think the anticipation is the hardest part. I think what I did to calm myself down before going is I would just listen to my favorite very happy and bright songs, and just make sure I'm in a good mood, eat something, have something sweet beforehand as well, just for that energy boost. So I think those would be my top tips for right before you go into the exam.
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin. And I think that reminds me of people talking about doing things like running marathons. You know, you've done all the work already, and in a way you just have to get on with it when you actually get to the start line, don't you?
Yeah.
Nell, thoughts from you on that?
Hi, yeah, of course. I think I completely agree with Yasmin. It is really a mind game actually getting through the exams. And as I'm sure everyone's heard, there are a lot of horror stories about the SQE 1 in particular. But from someone that's passed, I would say that it's not actually as bad as everyone makes out. You're very supported at BPP in terms of past papers, which I found were the most useful thing in my preparation. And I would really recommend doing multiple full sit exams to prepare yourself and build up that stamina. In the first few weeks of your prep course, you will think, how on earth am I going to do that many questions in that time frame? Because it probably takes you about half an hour to do 10 questions. But the reality is you do just speed up, you get really fast. You almost learn to recognize patterns in the way the questions are written as well, the more that you do. And again, in terms of the actual timing during the exam, it felt completely different almost to even the mock papers that I'd done, despite having done multiple full sits. You just have the adrenaline in the moment. You don't actually find that your focus drifts like you might expect because you're so focused in that one exam. And I actually found I had quite a lot of time to spare. I had plenty of time to check through my flagged questions. I even went for a bathroom break during the exam and didn't feel time pressured at all. So I think all that preparation pays off.
Oh, that's great to hear. I think it's worthwhile mentioning when you said flagged questions that obviously because these are being sat online, there is a way you can flag a question to come back to if you're not sure about it. But we certainly would recommend that you make a selection because you may not have time to go back to it, even though you flagged it at a later time, because you may not have the time management skills that you've just displayed there in terms of being able to come back to it. In terms of the preparation for the exam then, both Yasmin and Nell, if we could maybe start back with Yasmin now. Obviously, BPP and there are other providers out there have got to get through an awful lot of material. What did you find from your journey through BPP's SQ1 preparation course that helped you particularly, say, from the classroom experience when you're in a live teaching situation? Yasmin, how did that help cement your understanding?
For me, I think it was more the structure that BPP provided. So a lot of it, so we did learn a lot in class, and of course we would come in with our questions, and it's obviously a different experience when you have teachers teaching it to you. So I would say that was very helpful, but the most helpful thing for me was probably the structure, because you do still have to do a lot of self-study. So I think before I started my course, I was told that it treated like a full-time job, 40 hours of studying per week. So a lot of that was, of course, done at home because you can only be in a classroom for so many hours. And the only reason that I think that I found self-study so easy and structured and I was efficient with how I was managing my time was because BPP did provide a structure and a syllabus and weekly readings and what to cover in each week. So I think that was what I found most helpful from the live teaching aspect. But yeah, I think self-study is a huge element, and making use of the resources that BPP provides is really important.
Now, maybe you could pick up on that in terms of the resources that helped you get exam ready. I think we've mentioned the sample questions, but what else helps you get to grips with the knowledge before you've accumulated it? So how do you learn the new stuff that you haven't come across before?
Yeah, so in terms of the new stuff, we have access online at BPP to all of our readings, and they're in the form of PowerPoints, or you've got the digital textbooks. You also get a paper copy of the textbooks if you're an on-campus student. I'm not sure about online, I can't speak to that, but on campus you get paper copies of the textbooks as well, which I actually preferred using. I found it a lot more tangible to see my progress throughout the textbook. It felt like I could see the end was in sight when I was doing my reading. And I also really found helpful in terms of the underlying law. I know not everyone has done the same in their undergraduate degrees. I'd actually done a law conversion, so I would say it was relatively fresh for me. But in terms of underlying law, BPP provide these really useful 1-hour refresher lectures of the underlying law, which are held live and you can answer questions, or you can watch a recorded version. And I found that I think there were 3 for each subject, correct me if I'm wrong, but I found those really helpful in just recapping my underlying law knowledge. And I thought that was a great resource.
That's a really good point. And Caroline, it's true, not just at BPP, but other institutions as well. We don't reteach this underlying law. So it's really important that candidates feel that they've got that in the bank, or they do so whilst they're on the course.
Absolutely. And one thing I mentioned when I talked about the new route, this new way of qualification, is that the SRA now says you don't need a law degree. And that, you know, that may be right as far as they're concerned in terms of ticking boxes to qualify, but actually in order to be able to pass these assessments, really it's very difficult to see how one can do that without either a law degree or having done a conversion like Nell, because you need that really strong foundation, because genuinely half the questions in the papers will be on those subjects. It's not tokenistic, is it, ladies? It really is a substantive number.
Yeah, I'd also like to just add, I was myself shocked with how many questions in the exam were based on black letter underlying law. So of course I had prepared for it, but when I saw, when I came out of the exam, I wasn't even sure whether I had done more practice area questions or underlying law questions. So it is really important to spend a lot of time preparing for that, and maybe even before you start your course, do a refresher of the different underlying law subjects.
Yeah, and I think having those textbooks, as you guys have mentioned, are really helpful because you can audit. Well, we've mapped what is in the SQE specification to what we put in our textbooks to make sure you're not going over stuff from your LLB or a conversion course that isn't in the exam. We make sure that what you see is what you need for the assessment. But it is true, Caroline, that we cannot, and no provider can guarantee 100% that we prepare the students for every single question that might come up in the SQE. Why is that?
Well, it's an interesting aspect of this whole SQE world, this new world that we are in now, because the specification, the assessment specification, both for SQE 1 and 2, is available on the SRA's SQE website. And actually in the chat, I've linked to that for a few people just because they were asking specific questions. That is the source of truth for us. It's the source of truth for all students, anybody else involved in the SQE. The specifications in reality are just a series of quite limited bullet points. So for BPP, for any other provider, for any candidate who's going into these assessments, you have to make pragmatic, informed choices about what it means you need to have learnt and what probably is outside scope. And we have done a very careful job of going through the specification against what we think people will need to know. And we are confident that what we provide gives them a really excellent foundation and a good opportunity to pass first time, which Yasmin and Nell both have done, which is fantastic to hear. But you know, we don't know precisely what is meant by each of those quite general, generic bullet points, and say it's our best guess of what will work. So it is possible every candidate is likely to go into an SQE1 exam and find there is at least one or two questions they simply don't know the answer to. But that's part of the game, getting back to the mind games again. Because there are 180 questions, because the specification is not that detailed, you have to assume there will be the odd question which you find very difficult or you don't know at all. And that's when you get to the point, as Johnny was saying, you should always select an option for that question, put what you think is the most plausible, flag it if you think that coming back to it will help you, but then just move on, because there are so many other questions in which you can demonstrate your knowledge and that you know you're secure with. But it is just a different game from other exams probably that most people have sat before.
Yeah, and I think the reassuring thing is that we know a lot of the people who now draft the questions at Kaplan because we worked with them at BPP and other places before, and so we're coming from a very similar place. So there's going to be very few questions that we don't think students will be prepared for, but you have to accept there will be one or two. Ladies, what was your experience in terms of the number of questions you came across when you thought, I'm not sure I know the answer to that one? Yasmin, do you remember?
Yeah, I think what helped me with that for SQE1 is that, which is actually quite different to how it is for SQE2, but with SQE1 you're quite prompted to what the answer could be. I mean, you have 4 answers in front of you and one of them's correct, so you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it correct. And I guess that kind of helps because if you have enough of an understanding, which is why it's so important to not just memorize the content but understand it, But yeah, so when you have a good enough understanding, you are able to kind of narrow down the questions and make an educated guess. I felt that a lot of the times I was making educated guesses. And I also, also to add on to Caroline's point on having the odd question that you just don't know, and let's say you do get that wrong, I think what helps is just to have such a breadth of knowledge and not neglect areas of law that you think aren't as important. For example, solicitor's accounts or the solicitor's codes of conduct. I think me putting some effort into learning those, which might seem a bit unimportant, narrow to learn, those scored me some points and made up for points that I had lost on other questions.
That's a good point, because investing time in professional ethics, which is what those subjects come under, the students answer those questions correctly better than any other subject across the SQE. So it's time certainly well spent. Just finally, before we leave the subject now, how did you manage with the odd question here and there that you thought you weren't prepared for?
Yeah, I certainly do. I've obviously done it quite recently. I certainly do remember a few questions that stick in my mind that I thought I have never heard of that before. You've just got to guess, and you'll realise when you're doing your mocks and you're marking your own work that quite often you can get a string of 20 questions in a row wrong, which might feel really, really scary. But actually, I probably shouldn't say this, you can get quite a lot wrong and still pass the exam. It's just about the way that they then mark your answers. Different questions are weighted differently depending on how difficult everyone found them. So if you're getting a question wrong and everyone found that question hard, it won't actually be worth as much.
Sure. And just to pick on one thing, there are 5 MCQ options. So you've got a 1 in 5 chance of getting it right, even if you do guess. So obviously, we're not leaving that to chance, because you'll never pass if you don't do the work. But even if you don't know, and there are 5 questions that you don't know, chances are you're going to get one of them right just by simply guessing.
And it's probably worth, isn't it, Johnny, just mentioning that the pass mark is set each time there's a sit, but the pass mark is generally somewhere in the high 50s. So that's something that gets determined and gets published after a particular sit, but that's where you're heading for.
Yeah.
So that's a lot that you can get wrong before you fail.
Absolutely. Let's move on to talk about SQE2, because there's quite a lot to unpack there. So, Caroline, just briefly, just give us an overview of SQE2. You need to have passed SQE1, generally speaking, before you can attempt SQE2. That's right, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. Yes. So for a student going through the standard route, you would sit SQE1. The results come out for SQE1 quite quickly, actually. So 5 or 6 weeks later, you will have your results. And then if you want to, you can enroll immediately onto SQE2 assessments, which I think certainly for Nell, I think that'll be what you did. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that you've got a mixture of oral and written skills, and the written skills to start with, the way those are assessed in some ways is a little bit like SQE1, because again, you're in Pearson VUE test centres, you're sitting at a computer, closed book, and you are undertaking these exercises in relation to those 4 skills on the right-hand side, which are very much the kind of skills you would expect the solicitor to be able to demonstrate. On the left-hand side, the oral skills assessments are undertaken face-to-face, which is, by all accounts, and we can talk to the students in a second, quite frightening, because you're often just in a room with an examiner, there being your client, whilst also assessing you, and you're either interviewing them or you are performing advocacy as if you're doing that before them as the judge. Thing to understand about SQE2, you've got these 6 skills, but actually, as it says in the second notch at the top, you have 16 tasks to do which span these skills and which span different areas of legal practice. So what it means is you have a number, or 16, relatively short, little assessments, but which all are bundled together to form as a whole the SQE2 assessments. So overall, you either pass it or you don't, based on your attempt at all 16 different aspects of your personal assessment. I mentioned earlier on today that it's not just a skills assessment. You see on that left-hand notch at the top, 50-50 split between knowledge and skills. So you might, for example, be asked to undertake a legal writing task in a business law and practice context, for example. You would need to know the associated company law or, you know, partnership law, whatever it was that was underlying the question you'd been asked, in addition to being assessed as to whether you write clearly and appropriately for the client and all the other things that they're looking for. They're also looking to see that you understand the law it is you're advising on. So as I mentioned, the written skills are done in Pearson VUE test centres, so you might even end up sitting those in the same place as you did SQE1. Oral skills are done face-to-face and only in 4 places in the country. So they're done in London, in Birmingham, in Cardiff, and in Manchester. The reality is then that for the oral skills part of your SQE, many people do have to travel because they're sat over 5 half days. The oral skills are done over 2 half days. And sometimes people do find that they have to go quite long distances to get the place that they need. I think that's all I'm going to say for the moment, Johnny.
That's great. Well, let's bring in the students. Yeah, Yasmin and Nell, I'll start off with you this time now. So you've just sat SQE2. Tell us about it. There are these 5 days. How did that feel compared to SQE1, actually going through the assessments themselves?
I think there's a general consensus that SQE2 is a little bit easier than SQE1. I'm not quite sure why. Personally, I found it a bit more challenging just because the level of depth of knowledge and understanding is completely different. And I think when you come to start studying for the SQE2, you realise that you actually only really had a recognitional knowledge of a lot of things from SQE1. So taking the time to actually understand some of those processes in the workshops and break them down and attempt the practice questions is really helpful. Personally, I also found, I think when people go into it, they're really nervous about the oral skills. I actually ended up finding those a lot easier than the written papers in the real thing. I don't know if that's just me personally. I don't mind sort of public speaking, but I do.
I've been teaching prospective solicitors for about 18 years now, and I would say that the prospect of an oral assessment is one that really does frighten. Oh, it's probably the wrong word, but I think a lot of candidates find it very, very worrying and get anxious about it, even if they're very strong students, clearly like yourself, because you haven't had many of those assessments and the answer isn't sitting in front of you like an MCQ. So I know you're waiting for your results. Be reassured that the pass rate is very high for SQE2, and therefore you should get through.
Yeah, hopefully. And from speaking to sort of my peers that also sat the exam, so please don't be scared of the oral skills. Most of my peers said that they actually found the oral skills went really well after they'd done the exams, and they were sort of pleasantly surprised.
I think it's that idea, that's bringing Yasmin out, of being on your feet and having to react spontaneously. How challenging is that then, Yasmin?
The thing is with the oral skills, I completely agree with Nell that it is more daunting at first than the written skills are. But once you go into them, I scored the highest in my oral assessments than I did in my written ones. And so I think the thing is with the orals is that there is only a certain number of topics or you'll learn this more once you're in your course, but there are different tests you can kind of learn and understand to be able that you'll use for advocacy, for example. And so there's a narrower range of things you need to memorize or know, which of course you should put a lot of attention and effort into all of them. But the thing is with advocacy, if you know the law well enough, you don't need to think too much on your feet. Whereas with the written skills and with client interviewing, I did feel that I had to be very spontaneous with a lot of my answers, and you need to know the law well enough to be able to answer the questions without having a prompt in front of you.
Oh, that's really interesting. Caroline, can I bring you in here and just can you explain the difference in terms of what you need to pass? There are 16 different stations, they call them. Do you need to pass them all? How does it work, and how does that compare with SQE1?
So on SQE2, this assessment we're looking at here, you've got the 16 different tasks, the 16 different stations. As I mentioned before, your mark in all of those 16 things is pulled together into a single mark, which is basically pass fail. And the good thing about that is if you have, you know, an unfortunate experience in one of your exams, all is not lost, because you will very likely be able to get it back by doing better in a couple of the other papers. So it's a sort of a blended outcome you get for SQE2. SQE1's a bit different. We showed you there are 2 papers, and you have to get the pass mark, whatever that is established to be, in each of those papers in order to pass SQE overall.
But you can bank paper 1 if you pass it, and if you fail paper 2, you have to resit it. But unfortunately with SQE2, if you don't pass overall, you have to resit the whole thing again. You can't bank any parts of it that you did well at, which is the jeopardy and all the good reason for making sure that you're very well prepared before you commit to sitting the assessment, I think.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, talking of assessments, these don't come cheaply, I'm afraid, everybody. You can see the costs in front of you. And for students sitting from October of this year, the total cost of sitting just once for each of the assessment has now exceeded £5,000. So you do need to be able to ensure that you've got that budgeted. Yasmin and now, what was your strategy into making sure you had that money? Were you working alongside the course, or did you have that banked before you started?
I had that banked before I started, so I did self-fund my SQE assessments.
And had a training contract with a law firm, and they kindly paid for the assessments and the BPP exams. Just on that point as well, Caroline mentioned people might have to travel for the SQE2 exams. Just a flag for people with training contracts, quite often your law firm will fund that travel, and mine actually paid for hotels for the nights before and during the oral exams, which was very kind of them. But that sort of puts people's mind at ease. Maybe that might be a route to go down.
And even if you're self-funding, if you can possibly afford to stay in the locality overnight rather than having to commute, you will find that will reduce your stress levels enormously. It's one of the things, Caroline, I was sort of alluding to the fact that some people perhaps don't have the money saved for the assessment fees and therefore have to work alongside the course that they do. And it always worries me that they have to sometimes overcommit with those working hours just to simply afford to pay for the assessments. What would your tip be if somebody knows that they have to obviously work alongside the course? What's the maximum amount of work you really think that somebody should be doing alongside any full-time course, whether it's BPP or anywhere else? Well,
I think if you do need to work, and many people do, it's a real, and there's actually a question in the chat about this. It will be a question of what works for your life situation and your circumstances, what your work options are, etc. If you need to work substantively, so by that I mean more than maybe a couple of evenings a week or sort of one day at the weekend or something like that, my recommendation is always to study part-time, so that allows you to earn the money that you need to pay your rent and keep things moving, to pay for your exams and everything else, and then just study more slowly, but hopefully in a much more sustainable way for you given your work obligations. A different option could be to work full-time in a concentrated block, to make the money and then to study full-time after that. So it really does depend on what the options are available to you. But because there's so much to learn, and because it does cost a lot to sit the assessments, it is worth potentially doing things just that little bit more slowly, but hoping to prepare once and to prepare the best possible way to make sure that you can pass first time.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say it's not a race to pass. Yeah, most people have a career of 25, 30 years or possibly more ahead of them. And to be honest, a year or two in that journey to make sure that you optimize your SQE journey is absolutely essential. The last thing you want is to have to go through resits. You only have an opportunity to sit SQE1 twice every year. And therefore your journey is going to be disrupted if you fail. So optimize everything you can do to pass first time, do the best course you can afford, and then you can minimize your outlay. Because what happens if you fail the exam, Caroline? What is there any difference in the fee you pay?
No. Well, say you've failed one paper of SQE1, you would only have to pay to resit the paper that you had failed. So actually on a resit you'd pay just over £1,000 rather than having to resit both and pay the whole amount. But there is a real difference between that and what most universities would do, which would be to ask you to pay a relatively tokenistic amount to resit their papers. That's not where we are here. You have to pay a significant amount of money. If you failed SQE2, to Johnny's point, you have to resit the whole of SQE2, which means you'd have to pay that more than £3,000 again.
But the pass rate for SQE2 is much higher.
But it is much higher, that's true.
And we got pass rates consistently above 90% at BPP for SQE2. So we are very confident that the vast majority of our candidates get through quite easily there. Okay, last point about fees. Caroline, are they included in any course fee for providers, or how does it work normally?
Generally not, no. So unless it says in absolute big lights that it is included, and I don't think anybody does it, it's on top of what you pay with your provider. So for example, with BPP, we set our own assessments for both SQE1 and SQE2, which we designed to be as helpful as possible to support people's preparation for the centralised, but we don't include the centralised assessments in our programmes. We give students time and space to go away and to sit those, and then to come back and carry on with their programme very often with the next stage.
Yeah, so our assessments are helping you prepare for that endpoint external assessment. And yeah, you choose when to sit the endpoint assessment, but we would always recommend you do so at the point shortly after you finish your teaching, because that's when the knowledge will be freshest. Right, let's move on. And talking about preparing and choosing the right course for you to succeed. Obviously, where you're sponsored, like one of our students here, you will be told where to go and study. But if you're not sponsored and you're self-funding, there are a lot of things to take into account. And I'm just showing you on the screen here, and you'll have these slides to take away. We can send you copies of these through Legal Chic ultimately after the event. But there are a whole range of courses starting right at the top there, where you've got master's versions that prepare you for SQE1 and 2, diplomas that are a little bit shorter but prepare you for SQE1 and 2, and then you've got conversion courses with SQE1, and then there are courses that are basically apps with very little teaching at all, if any, and some are just self-preparation with materials, and what you pay for you get. And there are all sorts of things to take into account in terms of your choice of provider. So for our student who's here today who is self-preparing, what was important to you when you chose an SQE provider?
So for me, it was I was doing a lot of research into law firms and what they were looking for, and I realized that a lot of the big law firms preferred candidates to go to BPP University, or if they didn't already have a training contract, then people who have done their SQE prep at BPP. And I also had a few family friends who were lawyers, and they had all mentioned that BPP is looked very highly upon, and so that was definitely a big factor. And I also really liked the structure of the course, so that it was very clearly laid out that first we'd be prepping for SQE1 and then doing those exams, and then prepping for SQE2 and doing those exams, and then doing the LLM modules. So for me, having that structure was just so reassuring to know that I wouldn't kind of be wasting the studying, doing it all at once and then doing the exams afterwards. So yeah, I really, those were the main things that drew me to BPP.
Cool. And we'll look at some of the programs that we have to offer just as an example of what the market's out there. There are obviously similar programs at other providers, but also very different programs at what we would call test prep providers that have very little, if any, teaching, but come at a much lower price point. But there is a risk of the opportunity to have an experience that is going to get you through the exam as quickly as you would want at some of the cheaper providers, certainly. Now, on that point, there are pass rates that are published every year by the SRA. What they don't do, though, Caroline, is to share their pass rates for individual providers with us, so we know how our individual students are doing. So we have to go through an exercise where we survey all our students and come up with how they're doing, and from the results we get, we show that we are performing consistently higher than the SRA's average pass rate, as you can see there. So for January 2026, the national pass rate you can see was 58%, and our pass rate was 80% for our students across all of our cohorts. It certainly shows that we're doing something right, doesn't it, Caroline?
Yeah, we like to think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a source of frustration. I don't think that's a secret that we can't receive results from the SRA in respect of people that we have prepared, because that would really help us to understand how they're getting on. But we do a lot of work, and teams Johnny works with spend a lot of time contacting our students just to get this information. But it's really gratifying when we do get the information to see how well people are doing relative to that national picture.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting because very few providers go through the exercise. Well, I would say every provider probably goes through the exercise and finds out how their students are doing, because that would be irresponsible if they didn't. But very few actually tell the market how their students are doing. I think you can probably form your own conclusions as to what that means, but we're very proud of how our students are doing. And these are pass rates across all cohorts. We haven't cherry pricked the sample. We've asked all our students, share your results with us, and these are the results we get. And it's something that you should give you confidence if you choose us as a provider. And then this is replicated in SQE2, you can see as well. Why is the pass mark much higher for SQE2? You can see it's in the 80s or thereabouts on average. Caroline, why is it much higher?
You mean the pass rate, don't you?
Sorry, the pass rate. Sorry, I beg your
yeah.
pardon.
So the pass rate, a lot of it will be because you've got that primary filter of SQE1. So the people going into SQE2 have already passed SQE1. They've already demonstrated they've got really solid knowledge, like Yasmin and Nell have both done already. Which means they're very well set up for SQE2. I think the risk for the SQE1 exams, bearing in mind that anybody can just enroll and sit them, is that some people will be woefully underprepared, and that will affect the percentage pass rate on a national level for the SQE1 exams.
Definitely, but you can see here we're still hitting the ball out of the park compared to the national pass rate. Yeah, we're averaging around about 90 or more percent, and the national pass rate is about 80 or just under 80% on average. So we're doing very well compared to that. And yeah, it's thanks to candidates like Yasmin and Nell who work very hard, and a tribute really to our design team who spent years designing the programme to get our candidates through first time, because these are first sit pass rates. Obviously, the pass rate will be slightly lower if you included re-sitters. Now, I just wanted to sort of briefly explain that there are a large amount of resources that students have access to at BPP, but also we provide free resources for anyone now. If you want to go onto our website, you can fill a form and get access to some free sample MCQs to just give you a flavour of what the SQE is all about. So just go onto our website, just search BPP and SQE MCQs, and you'll find it straight away, or click the link on the slides when you get through to them. The next thing I want to talk about is sort of how to effectively prepare in the last sort of few minutes that we've got, and in particular, how we structure our course to effectively prepare. So we have our flagship course, which is the LLM, which I think Yasmin has done, which starts off with SQE1 preparation. You sit SQE1, then you go through SQE2 preparation, sit SQE2, and there is then a third term that actually is nothing to do with the SQE, but is really important and really thought of very highly by law firms. What is this third term, Caroline, and why is it so popular?
Well, in fact, both of the students that are with us today have done a version of this program, including a version of Essentials for Practice, which is what we're talking about. So this is the way in which we are doing our very best to help students once they've got through the rigors of SQE 1 and 2, which everybody has to do whether they like it or not. Once they've got through that, to actually really focus in on knowledge that's specific to the area of practice they want to get to, that is supported by development of the professional behaviours which are really useful in law firms. So the O-shaped lawyer is a group of in-house lawyers who've put together behaviours they consider to be essential in the solicitors who work for them, and we work with that group to make sure that the materials for Essentials for Practice support our students in developing those skills and behaviours to make sure that they're the best possible prepared. We want to make sure that those students are desk ready to go out into the world and perhaps start their qualifying work experience, or indeed to go into qualification if they've already done QWE, understanding how law firms work, understanding the business side of law firms, and making sure that when they're a trainee in particular teams or they qualify into a particular team, that they have a really good understanding of how the law in that area works.
Fabulous. And it's worth mentioning that you packaged these three components up in a year's worth of study into a master's, which for domestic students, most domestic students who have not been through a master's before, has an additional funding benefit. What is that, Caroline?
So if you're a domestic student, yes, there is the opportunity to have master's funding for your first master's. So you must not have done a master's before and drawn the funding. But for anybody who is eligible for that, £13,206 for many students is absolutely a game changer in terms of supporting their ability to study. So note that that is domestic students only, though.
And of course, you can get help with scholarships as well from BPP. And this master's funding isn't available at a lot of the institutions that are selling SQE courses, because they're not universities and they don't run master's level or master's courses. So the quick test prep options, you'll have to find that money, earn it or borrow it elsewhere at much higher rates than from the student finance company. And this has the added benefit of delivering this extra content, which the law firms look at very favourably, and as Caroline says, makes you desk ready on day one of your training contract or qualifying work experience, as we now call it. So there are various different ways you can prepare, and if you're a non-law graduate, you can compare your combine your conversion course with the SQE1 preparation into a master's and finance it in a similar way as well, and then pick up the SQE2 preparation after that. There are various other ways that you can go down an SQE journey, and our job now is not to just go through every option that BPP or anyone else has to offer, but you can break it down and disaggregate it. You could just commit to SQE1 if you wanted to, and then go off and do some more work before you want to commit to SQE2. It's horses for courses, and I think that's the wonderful thing about the new regime. It's not so new now, is that it does give a lot of options in terms of how you approach your studies. Okay, I'm just going to refer very briefly to the fact that there are sample questions on the SRA's website. There's lots of further information available, so just check that out on the slides once you get to see them, because you'll find those links very useful indeed. In the meantime, we've got about 5 or so minutes left. What I wanted to do first was to go back to both Yasmin and Nell, just to give us maybe some top tips as to what you think would be a game changer had you known it on day one of your SQE journey. What do you now know that you wish you had known that could have made a bit of a difference? Start off with Yasmin.
I guess this is a bit of a silly one. It might seem a bit like a silly one, but I went into my preparation comparing myself to everyone and thinking that my study method was wrong, and that because I was doing something different to what most people were doing, and then going into a spiral of, oh, I'm going to fail because I'm studying differently to everyone else. Because, for example, I would focus more on just writing and rewriting the content over and over and over again, until I felt like it was engraved in my brain. And then I left MCQs to last minute. So I didn't really touch MCQs until the last week or two before the exams. And so that entire process just had me in a spiral of overthinking. I should have done this instead. I should have done that instead. And then even once I sat the exams, I was convinced I would fail because I had studied so differently to everyone else. But then I just realized that everyone studies differently. I found what worked for me, and I wish that I had gone into my preparation knowing that. So knowing that not everyone's going to follow the exact same structure, or the same study method, or the same pace. So I think I wish I had known that going in, because it would have helped a lot mentally and confidence wise. And I think a big part of SQE is confidence. So just be so sure of yourself and get to a point of studying that you're so confident.
That's brilliant. And I think I could reflect on the comments that Caroline and I made on the article that Legal Cheek published this week, which was the reverse of what you did. And that was the idea that some students just obsess about doing MCQs and don't get solid on the underlying law. And that's a lot worse than what you did, because you were solid on the underlying law, which meant then approaching the MCQs was much easier because you had that platform of knowledge. Caroline, you can't learn the course just through doing MCQs, can you?
No. Unfortunately, that would be a very simple in a way of doing it. But no, you do need to know the law first. You want to use those MCQs to really refine your technique and check your understanding, but you need to be doing that later in the process, not at the start.
Good stuff. And Nell, any top tips from you?
Yeah, I think probably one of my main tips, and I wish I'd done this earlier, was to utilise my classmates more. We all essentially had a full set of really comprehensive notes as exams were coming close. And some people had flashcards, some people had made their own questions, some people had full sets of notes. And about mid-December, someone popped in our little group chat, does anyone want to sort of exchange their notes and share resources? And we did, and I was gobsmacked at how useful that was. I personally hadn't made flashcards, but one of my classmates shared their Quizlet decks, and they were so helpful to just mix up the studying a bit. You'll be surprised. You think there's so much to learn, you can never learn it all, but you almost get a bit bored of revising by the time the exams come, because you're repeating the content over and over and over again, and actually then suddenly seeing the same information fresh in someone else's words, it kind of triggers it slightly differently in your brain. So yeah, I think utilize your classmates. They might have explained something better than you, and you want to steal a bit of their notes for your notes, or they might have done a good diagram or made great flashcards. So I think, yeah, lean on each other.
Yeah, having a study buddy or two or three in that case possibly is gold dust, because, as you say, they look at things from a different perspective. And sometimes, even though you might not be a visual learner might just present something in some sort of pictogram that makes sense of something that you haven't thought about it that way before. But yeah, everyone learns differently, as we've just heard. Caroline, any top tip from you as somebody who's been right there from the start of the SQE, seeing students go through? What's the top tip you would give to success?
I think the top tip I would say is that people need to appreciate the volume of what it is they will need to know, and just be organized. And that's easy for me to say sitting here comfortably in my job, but you need a plan. You need to be prepared to flex that plan if life events occur. You might not be well or whatever it might be, but you overall need to see a roadmap for yourself for how you're going to get from the start of your studies through to those exams. And then you need to hold yourself to that, because if you can keep calm and carry on and have your plan, it won't have that anxiety that you're not going to get there in time. You won't find that you get to the exams and you've got the anxiety that you're not going to be answering all the questions. I noticed that, Yasmin, you've got your hand up. Is there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to the MCQ aspect. So one thing I found very helpful with the MCQ, so practicing MCQs, was not just to get some practice for technique, but also when I was doing MCQs, I would look at every single answer I got correctly, look into why I got it correct, and just kind of reiterate and reinforce that legal knowledge in my brain. And then also any answer I'd get wrong, of course, I would do a deep dive and understand why that answer was wrong and why the other answer would be correct. And then that way I'm learning kind of two sides of it. So I'm learning what's wrong, what's right. And then I just built that pattern, and I would work on MCQs that way rather than just to see my progress.
I think that's a really good point, Yasmin, because there is a risk if you answer an MCQ correctly in practice that you just say, oh gosh, well done me, and on you go. And you might just have got lucky, actually. You might have slightly misunderstood the point, but managed to get it right anyway. Doing what you're talking about doing there means that you can be certain that you understand the reasoning, and that next time you meet a question that might be slightly different, you will be able to answer it properly as well.
Brilliant. Well, on that point, which actually touched on something that Caroline and I discussed in the Legal Jig article that was published the other day. It's all about making sure that you have that deep learning, understanding why an answer is wrong as much as you understand why the correct answer is right, and that will really mean that you've really understood the subject. Well, we've reached our time. The first hour is up. Thank you so much, Nell and Yasmin, for your fantastic contributions. I always think when we hear from students who've been through the process, those of you listening feel a lot more, hopefully more reassured that this is doable. It is a difficult journey, but you've had two great candidates there explain their route to success, and they've come out of it still smiling, which is great. Thank you so much for your time. Julia is now going to explain what's going to happen next for the second hour, when we will be able to answer all of your questions, well, not all, but as many of the questions as we possibly can do. Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Yasmin. And thank you, Nell. Everything has been very, very useful. I'm going to be starting the SQE myself, so I'm taking all your tips to heart. So as I mentioned in my intro, we'll be moving over to the networking session, where all of the lovely speakers will be able to answer some, if not all, of your questions. And that will be running in the Expo booths, which you can tune into if you click on the Expo booth on the sidebar on the left-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to be brave. You will be able to go up onto the stage, turn your cameras on and your mics on to ask your questions. Don't just hide away in the chat. It's a useful skill for a lawyer to be able to speak to people that they don't know particularly well, so we always encourage it. But thank you to the audience, thank you to all of our speakers, and enjoy.
Thank you so much. So everybody, see you in the Expo in the next few minutes, and thank you again, Yasmin and Nell. See you soon.